Privilege for me to be here at the Mangaluru Lit Fest. This is the part of the country where I am from, so I'm very honored to be invited back here. I was here in 2019, and I'm back again this year. So thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me back to my land. This is my native land, and always good to be back in this beautiful place. So thank you all for your time, also on a beautiful, warm Sunday morning to be here to discuss today an issue that is very close to my heart, very close to the hearts of the people you have on this panel with me here today, which is a great honor for me and for all of you, and something that I believe that not enough people know enough about. I think it's very important that this is something that people hear more about, and I can't think of a better panel to discuss it this morning than the people we have here today. The topic of today's panel discussion is the Indian military, the way ahead. But I have decided to narrow it down a little further to not just the Indian military, but since we are a country that has been in a war-like situation for almost 3 years now on our Ladakh border with China, I thought that would be the best topic to discuss. What better topic to discuss than something that we have right in front of us, something that threatens our security, our sovereignty, our territory, and look at it through the eyes of three experts who write about it, who have taught about it, who have experienced it in some respects, and in many ways have also been part of the planning process for India's military over the years. So I'd like to start by introducing Air Vice Marshal Manmohan Bahadur. He is a decorated pilot from the Indian Air Force. He has served for many years. He's a helicopter pilot, one of the first to land in Siachen, but his experience and his wisdom goes way beyond just being a pilot. He's a commentator and a columnist and one of India's most well-regarded writers and commentators on strategic and defense affairs. Welcome, Air Vice Marshal Bahadur. Professor Bharat Karnad also needs no introduction. He's Emeritus Professor of National Security Studies at the Center for Policy Research in Delhi. He's one of India's most read and most sought after strategic and columnists and thinkers and writers on military and defense affairs. And Shiv Kunal Verma is a military historian. He's a filmmaker who's had very wide experience. He's written best-selling books on the Indian wars with both Pakistan as well as China, and I would highly recommend his book on the 1962 war. It is by far the most credible, most detailed, and I think the most hard-hitting book about a war that most people here in India would rather forget, but it's a war that I think all of us should remember as a country, especially given what we are facing right now. Air Vice Marshal Bahadur, I will start with you, sir. In May this year, it will be 3 years since the standoff in eastern Ladakh began. It has changed dramatically since it began. There are huge deployments taking place there. It has been 3 winters past since the world's 2 largest standing armies came face to face. In some cases, standing just a few hundred meters apart in parts of eastern Ladakh, we understand. There has been no fighting there since the Galwan clash of 2020, but it is still a precarious situation. I wanted your opening assessment of where India is 3 years into this standoff with China. Where are we right now, sir?
First of all, thank you very much for coming here. My first trip to Mangalore, beautiful country side you've got, as I saw yesterday. But let's get to Ladakh, which is also a beautiful place. I spent my life there, literally. Up in the borders in Ladakh, that as Shiv brought out, the 2 armies are now deployed, brought back because of various talks that have happened. But it is still a stand-to sort of a situation, as the army calls it. The deployment is there, our antenna are up, we are monitoring the situation, and what it does to us more than the Chinese is that we have to maintain our army, huge deployment throughout the year. So something that we were doing along the Pakistan border, we are now having to do on the northern border too. But it's a price that any country will pay to safeguard its borders and independence. and that's a price that we must be willing to pay. The politicians and the diplomats then take over and see how to ameliorate the situation so that such trigger, happy type of situation, trigger alert type of a situation doesn't exist. But when this happened in 2020, two schools of thought that we were taken by surprise. People say no, we knew it was happening. But the fact remains that the Chinese diverted a large mass of their ground troops from an exercise onto the borders. And then we had to really deploy fast. And that's where the army moved by road, and the Air Force put everything, all their transport helicopter assets up front. And the fighters started operating from there. At that point of time, 3 years back, and if you notice, it was quite a belligerent attitude of the Chinese. They upped the ante. They realized that India is not backing down. The Air Force got deployed, and there are enough writings to say, and I have written about it too, that it was the Indian Air Force which was predominantly strong and would carry the war, or if it came to war, to the Chinese. Because of various things that came about yesterday, our deployments, our airfields, the positioning of the airfields, and our better assets and a better training. Certainly, if you've realized, last 2 years the Chinese have throttled back. But there are so many news reports of tremendous deployment, construction, infrastructure coming up along the eastern Ladakh side. Radars, heliports, some airfields, dispersals, underground storage. So that all what is happening is to counter the asymmetry, the positive asymmetry that Indian Air Force or India had with respect to that border. They've used these 3 years. I personally feel these talks, which don't seem to be going anywhere now, because DBO and Chumar are the two places that they have not given an inch, while we have, there has been withdrawal along the Pangong Tso Lake. So I personally feel, Shiv, that they have used these 3 years to boost up their air defense, and now, and I'm sure the troops know more, the headquarters know more with their intelligence. We really have to be on the guard, because they have brought up the air defense structure. So both the sides are facing each other and are keeping our antenna up.
Professor Karnad, your assessment, sir, of the situation. 3 years in, where do things stand in your view?
Shiv, am I audible? Am I audible now? I too am from, like Shiv, from hereabouts. I'm from Dharwad, and I schooled at the Belgaum Military School, King George's, and most of my friends are in the military. So I have an emotional link, as it were, to the Indian Armed Services. That said, I think the Indian military, let me preface my remarks by saying that I respect it hugely. It's a great fighting force, but it's not strategic minded, unfortunately, has never been. Because as a colonial army that virtually overnight became a national army, it did not have the tradition of thinking strategically. And therefore, we lost out. And that is manifest in the fact that assuming Pakistan was ever a threat, it really never was in realistic terms, but assuming it was, by 1971, after India had bifurcated that country, there should have been no threat at all, and it should have then switched to China. Instead, for 50 years now, we have labored under the same Pakistan Western border orientation, which has taken our resources and our manpower and every other aspect of national life away from the main theater of operations, as it should have been, military theater of operations, to a minor foe, which is Pakistan. Just to give you an inkling of just how minor Pakistan is as a credible threat, its GDP is 1/13th, it may be 1/17 by now, actually it's almost collapsing, it might be 1/20th or 1/30th of the market cap of the Mumbai Stock Exchange, for God's sake. If you're going to be frightened of a Pakistan, then are you not going to be awed or super awed by China, which is the largest economy in the world, going to be very soon.
Yeah.
And you have really not prepared for it. Honestly speaking, what the Air Vice Marshal has said, and others may say about the military, that they have deployed, they have tried to make the best use they could of the resources at hand. The fact of the matter is, we did not prepare to deal with the Chinese for all of 70 years. We have been politically naive, gullible even, and therefore we have accepted what the Chinese said at the word. It's the wrongest thing to do. The Chinese have, and I always said that strategic mindedness, if any people manifested, it's the Chinese. It's the Chinese. If any people lack the strategic mindedness, it is India and Indians. And therefore, there's so much, bigger territory that Indians have to traverse in a strategic sense before getting to be a match for the Chinese. And that's what I mean. Our entire military is completely inadequate to deal with China. Look at all our forces. The Air Force, the Air Vice Marshal is saying, it's one of my pet peeves as well, that there's no aircraft right now that is not short-legged, meaning very short-range aircraft, just about every aircraft. Sukhoi 30 is not a long-range aircraft. It's a medium-range aircraft, 700 kilometers up, fully loaded. So you're not going to get very far dealing with China if you have a Sukhoi 30. That's the longest range aircraft we have, and so on. Most of our orientation, military orientation, is westward. We have only so many mountain divisions. We have only now the first offensive mountain corps, after I've been talking about for 35 years, and I remember in my first classified report to the government as a member of advisor to the Finance Commission India in 1995, I said we should now begin having an offensive mountain corps, and very quickly, Shiv,
Yes.
Reorganizing our 3 strike corps into one composite corps and shift the resources Chinaward to have ultimately 4 offensive mountain corps. Offensive in the sense, not with heavy tanks, because you cannot operate these damn tanks in the mountains. That should have been obvious to everybody. We should have had light tanks with high torque engines that could fire at rarefied airs of the high altitude, and we should have had those kinds of formations. We don't have it. So what we are doing right now is doing the best we can with what we have, and it may be inadequate. Of course, it's another thing, the Chinese have to worry about various other threats, and therefore we too get into that threat matrix, and we perhaps then have a way out in terms of, shall we say, getting a relief of sorts.
Just as a small follow-up question, Professor Karnad, the report that you submitted, which year was that?
No, this is, it was a classified report. I wish they'd unclassify it. It is how we used our resources from 1950 on. That's my timeline, to the time the Finance Commission, 10th Finance Commission under K.C. Pant, who was our defense minister previously, he was the chair, up to 1985 or 89, something like that. That's the timeline, really. And my study brought out just how monies were misspent, as I saw it. As I saw it. Just in a sense reinforcing the very short legged kind of forces that could not operate at a distance.
And in fact, many of the things that were there in that report, just by way of a small example, are some of the technologies that India is trying to get on an urgent basis now, owing to the current standoff. So stuff that we should have been preparing for earlier with a China focus are now kind of emergency procurements, and with the monster at our doorstep, we are being forced to look at those things. So I'll come back to that aspect that Professor Karnad mentioned about preparation and why we didn't think this kind of thing was going to happen in just a moment. But to bring Kunal Verma into this, Shivji, the 1962 war is something that you are deeply familiar with. He's written the best-selling book on that war. There is a sense that much has changed since the 1962 war. India is not the India of 1962. The Chinese kind of hit a wall as far as India was concerned. They couldn't come marauding in and The, the more flamboyant television anchors say we taught them a lesson and things like that. What is your assessment, since you've gone deep into 1962 compared to where things are right now with Ladakh? What is your view, sir?
First of all, of course, it's always wonderful to be here. I completely agree with what Professor Karnad has just said. And I have to go a little step forward and then further back. In fact, let's go back to the genesis of the Chinese problem. Let's look at 1949 itself, when they first took Xinjiang and then they took Tibet, etc., etc. India has always been very reactive. We've had certain sessions in our military history where we did get a little proactive as we went along, but even that proactiveness was always the overall scenario was reactive. China identified India as a major enemy right from the word go, because the Chinese have this very simple philosophy that there cannot be two tigers on one hill. And the 1962 conflict, there were various reasons for it as to how it actually, over the decade, how things happened, and there were people in the Indian establishment then, people like General Thorat, General Kalwant Singh. The Kalwant Singh report in 1953 predicted the 1962 action. And then there was this exercise Lal Killa in March of 1961. Eastern Command at that time used to be in Lucknow, which was conducted by General Thorat, where he talked about a defensive line, which made a lot of sense, but they just kind of poo-pah'd it.
Yeah.
In fact, he even predicted the dates of the attack. I mean, that's how my 62 book actually really starts. China, after the 62, there were two reasons, which, according to me, which actually led to the 62 conflict. One was the basic clash between Nehru and Mao. Apart from the two countries jostling in the post-colonial period to establish themselves as major leaders in the world order, it was also Mao versus Nehru. And Mao actually openly said so in 1962, that he told the Chinese leadership that, in fact, our ambassador, Mr. Panikkar, was present, that give India a tight slap, make sure it lasts for 50 years, and then do it again. So when we talk about what happened in Western Ladakh, etc., in 2020, etc., it was coming, because for years we've been talking about it. The professor says his report was up till 1985, but I know that my dad was involved in the in operation, that exercise checkerboard, in 1988. And he was made the Chinese commander. And the army commander and the co-commander, that time, I won't name those guys, but they later on went on to become chiefs and stuff like that. They gave themselves the roles of Indian commanders. And I remember my dad, he was that time commanding 26th Infantry Division in Jammu. And he was suddenly given the role of the Chinese commander. So they wanted to, Rajiv Gandhi was coming for this exercise, and he was supposed to get nicely hammered into the ground and sit down quietly. So he asked General Rodriguez, who was his immediate boss, and he said, do you want me to think like an Indian Chinese general, or you want me to think like a Chinese general? And they said, no, Ashok, go ahead, think like a Chinese general. And the war was over in 3 minutes. Because at that time, they said, we'll come. So in the presentation from the Chinese side, they said, we'll come in from Gilgit. And they said, but sorry, that's unfair. We haven't planned for that.
Yeah.
But that's exactly what happened later on. And the complete lack of being able to project into the future and see how things go. To come back to your question, whether we are as prepared in 1962 as we are now, I think we are definitely a different country. There are a lot of other things at play. It's not just as to how many troops are facing who. And I also feel that it's a terrible mistake to try and match China. If they build a tunnel, we build a tunnel. If they build a road, we build a road. If they make a railway line, we make a railway line, because our problems are very different. We have to play to our own strengths. And I have been advocating, as I even spoke about it yesterday, that listen, bring in, use your strengths. I mean, go and that G219 highway, which the Chinese are getting very jumpy, about 32 kilometers coming under their artillery guns in the DBO sector. Yeah. We've got a 4,500 kilometer target. I spoke to the air chief at that time when I was writing this article for Sunday Guardian, where I advocated this, and I asked him, I said, sir, can we hit them everywhere? And he said, yes, we can. Okay, first he talked about S-400s and this, that, but I said, okay, now supposing you are given the political backing, you are given the political will, can we take them out? And let me tell you, in 2020, the Air Force's role, as ABM Bahadur initially
Yeah.
in his opening remarks talked about, the Air Force played a very, very significant
Yeah,
role.
I'm going to ask him about
because
that.
we immediately showed the intent to use the Air Force as an offensive platform, which we did not do in 1962.
Right.
And had we done it in 1962, the outcome would have been different.
Which brings me precisely to my next question, because one of the most famous, publicly known facts about 1962 was this governmental hesitation in deploying the Air Force in 1962. It was a complicated issue. War is always a complicated issue, but there is a general perception that if India had been allowed to use the Air Force, perhaps some parts of that war would have been different. Air Vice Marshal Bahadur, to bring you on to the point that Shivji just mentioned about the use of the Air Force, we did see it. Even from the media, it was quite visible in the opening days of the standoff that there was a very visible deployment of the Air Force. We had our attack helicopters there. When the Rafales came in, they were sent there
Straight away.
quite immediately.
Yeah.
They just had a small stopover at their home base, and then they were in Ladakh. We saw the virtually all types of the Indian Air Force combat fleet. What kind of role did the Indian Air Force play in the standoff in those early days as well as now, sir?
Okay. There are two things, and when you talk of deterrence, and Professor Karnad can speak much more about deterrence, but deterrence by denial, deterrence by punishment. That means, listen, if you do something funny, I have got the assets to punish you. So the other guy gets deterred. And deterrence by denial is, we are strong enough, so why attack us? Because nothing will happen. So what happened in 2020 was, we showed our fangs, our teeth in a way, to say, listen, if you don't stop, we will strike you. And we showed our assets. And our capability, our aircraft assets, our training of pilots is much better, but slowly, and in fact the Chinese are really catching up. You would have heard that they hired British pilots through South Africa to train their pilots in Western tactics. So they are going about it the big way. They know that they have gone on the Russian ethos, which was not too good, and they want to improve, and they're improving. So what we did was that when we showed our, got the air assets going up, it was an indication that we will strike. And to talk about striking the highway and the railway line and the bridges, all of them are within range. Let's not throttle back on this. The fact remains that all those targets, those bridges, all those things are
All
within
those
range.
things that they're building now
All of them in Tibet are within strike range of our assets now. There are no two ways about it. Okay, and I'm quite sure our people are training in a very practical way for doing that. But what I said was that they've used these 3 years to beef up their air defense cover, which was very sparse in the Tibetan region, because the airfields were far spaced. There were hardly any radars. They have done the gap filling sort of. So now the message they are trying to send us is, they are trying to deter us by denial, saying that if you come, you'll get hit by our air defense. This is what they have been trying to do in the last 3 years, and I'm quite sure the government is aware of this, and the required steps must be taken.
So would we be right in saying, just so that the audience understands it clearly, sir, as a military man, would we be right in saying that over the last 3 years, part of what the Air Force would have been doing is, identifying all these targets? So they would have theoretically a bunch of targets in case the balloon goes up, in case there are hostilities. They have designated targets that they can hit.
At any given time, all our squadrons have got something called target folders. These are the targets. People know what they will strike. There are war plans, like the Army, the Navy. They've all got war plans and target folders ready. So when new areas or targets of interest arise, intelligence is fed, they are studied, and new targets are assigned. So though that is a continuous process during peacetime, and the training is during peacetime is what to do in case the balloon goes up.
Just very quickly, last corollary on this air power issue, Air Vice Marshal. Does India have the upper hand as far as air power is concerned in eastern Ladakh at this point of time?
Present
Because
war,
we've seen reports about them being at a higher altitude, their bases being at a higher altitude, etc.?
Okay. Let's clarify this point of the altitude. The higher you go, the air becomes less dense, and hence the amount of load an aircraft can carry becomes lesser. All their airfields opposite Tibet, not so much towards the eastern side, that is opposite Sikkim, but in Tibet are high, 10,000, 11,000, 12,000. Our airfields, other than Leh and Thois, they are all along the plains, 100, 200, 300, 5. Srinagar is 5,000 maximum, Avanti is 5,500. So our load carrying capability is much more. Our capability to deliver, and all our airfields along the plains, which are there, Sarsawa, Gorakhpur, Hashimara, Bagdogra, Tezpur, Guwahati, they are all in the plains, and from there we've got the range to strike. And hence the payload that we can deliver. But remember, any war now, modern war is fought between systems.
Yeah.
It is not my aircraft is better than your aircraft, or your aircraft is better than mine. It is system. And how good you have made your system, how well you have assimilated your modern assets into your air defense, electronic warfare, surface-to-air missiles, airborne early warning, all those things. How good is your system and your training against the other guy's system? So as far as this is concerned, it's work in progress. We must acknowledge that they have the technology, the Chinese that is. Okay, we have, it's work in progress both sides. Who's better, I can't say. But the fact remains that we are carrying on.
Professor Karnad, once again in the media, one tends to sort of oversimplify with leading questions as far as India and China are concerned. Does either country have an upper hand in this situation right now? Because from the outside, it looks like things have kind of frozen. Post Galwan, there has been no actual fighting. Infrastructure is coming up, apparently on both sides, but it's kind of frozen. It's become a kind of grind right now. What is your perception, sir, about does either side have the upper hand?
Yeah, before I answer that question, can I just go back? You said Tezpur in 62, and I think Shiv, you would bear me out as well. People like Air Marshal Jayal, who was the Commander-in-Chief, Eastern Command, he told me that he was sitting in his Fugamistier on the Tezpur airfield, ready to take off because they were expecting orders to deal with the Chinese.
In 62?
That's right, in 62.
Yeah,
Especially with Harbaksh as 4-corps commander right there calling in. Yes, call in a strike and stuff. They were ready to go.
Yeah,
but
my boss, Air Chief Marshal Tipnis, was in the cockpit in Alwara, ready to go in a hunter. So I mean,
but the orders never came.
Yeah, the point I think is that they're not just ready to go. They turned on the engines and they're sitting there with the airplane shuddering to take off with the brakes on. And the order came down, stand down. Now, the frustration is precisely because, by the way, the real reason was B.C. Roy, who was then the Chief Minister of West Bengal, as perhaps some of you recall, told Nehru, please don't use the aircraft to bomb the Chinese positions or the PLA because they might respond by bombing Calcutta. And Nehru accepted that advice. And therefore, our best card, if we could have played against the Chinese in 62, was not played. In other words, the advantage we had, the only advantage we had, was Air Force, and we didn't use it. And which leads me to believe that will we use that advantage, assuming we have it, Air Vice Marshal, in even imminent or imminent, fracas on the border? I doubt it. The reason being, and the reason I'll tell you why did we vacate the posts on the Kailash range, as some of you perhaps read the newspaper?
The South Pangong, yeah.
Why did we vacate them? There was no reason to vacate. It was the first real success of the entire encounter where the Indian Special Forces, the Special Frontier Force, that's geared for warfare at heights, captured it, and suddenly the Chinese found that they were looking down on the Moldo garrison.
Yeah.
And the Chinese got spooked. Why did we give it up without anything in return, adequate return that we should have insisted on? And in any case, we shouldn't have vacated it because we claimed that to be part of the LAC. So how come the Indian government decided to withdraw virtually unilaterally? Because they said, oh, well, they're firming up the line on the fingers on the northern Pangong shore and so on. Doesn't make military sense. That's precisely the problem. So when you say that, well, yeah, we have the advantage, well, yes, the advantage doesn't matter unless you use it.
Let's use it.
Yeah.
May I just make a point
Yeah.
in the same thing?
Sure.
It's not just the Air Force which was ready to go in 62, even Seahawks and Alizés had
Of the
been
Navy.
moved up to Gorakhpur. They were also ready to go. Individual bridges, individual targets. So a slight correction on what you said. In fact, when I was doing the history of the Air Force in 1992, we had just finished interviewing Air Marshal A.K. Devon, who had been the CNC in 71. And I'd finished my conversation with him, and I was packing up the Sennheiser mics and stuff like that, when he said, I want to talk about 1962. So I looked at him and I said, what about it? And he said, I was ACS Ops. And he came up with something which was so stunning that actually even Air Headquarters went into a virtual paralysis when they heard this. He said the decision to not use the Air Force has been given to, it was a political decision, all writers have said that, but actually it was a decision which was brought about by two people. One was B.M. Malik, who for some strange reason advised against using the Air Force, despite the fact that a PLA aircraft had actually defected to Taiwan and the Americans had handed over that pilot to us. We knew China does not have aviation fuel. We knew they can't get airborne. Jaggi Nath was flying his Canberra all over the place, not once did they intercept him.
Yeah.
And yet we decided not to do it. And what Devan said was that the decision not to do this was mine. And I said, why the heck would you say that? So he called up his logbooks and he showed me, he was in 7 or 4 Squadron during the Arakhan's operation.
Yeah.
And he said, I flew 471 sorties, we were looking for the Japanese, we never saw them. So the same thing applies. I said, sir, have you ever flown in that area? You were CNC East. What are you talking about? Because the passes are so narrow. A couple of napalm attacks over there. The Chinese were petrified of this because even on the night before the Nankachu attack, they were hauling up anti-aircraft guns onto the Thagla Ridge because even one vampire sortie would have changed things.
Yeah,
sir.
actually he was a group captain that time.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, he was a group captain that time, and I have read that there was a group captain, H.C. Devan, who moved this note. So, I mean, when you think back with hindsight, you really wonder how it was
Amazing.
done. Amazing, but it is a fact. The point about withdrawal from the hills and all. Professor, the point is like this. Finally, it's a political decision, and you rightly use the word the government of India. I don't think any one of us, at least I don't know, what was the reason why we withdrew from there. But because when you see from outside, you do feel that why did we? We had a strong point there. And after that, the Chinese have just dug their heels in on DBO, the Depsang plains. And I've flown enough in that area to tell you that the way they have moved, and now those areas which are a no-go for our troops to go patrol, brings them very, very close to a track junction and DBO. I do not know how flying is going on there. We have a different route, of course, available. But why it happened, one doesn't know. There must have been something. I really don't know.
May I just
Yes,
add one
yes.
thing? The PLA now has built a bridge, a two-way bridge, from the northern Pangong shore to get
to
to the
south.
Moldo garrison, and that will, speed up the redeployment or switching the forces from northern shore to Moldo and the Kailash range. Should they ever want to do that, they've cut down the shift time from about 3 to 4 days to a few hours, 13 hours. They can bring in a reinforced deployment right into Moldo. I mean, the point to make really is that somewhere, sometime, and invariably, it so seems to me anyway, that the government of India loses its nerve. It doesn't have the nerve to fight. If I may say so very, perhaps plainly, doing some plain speak. It has happened again and again that we are in these situations and we invariably back down. So, now, you can say that Group Captain Devon was responsible for that op decision at the time. And B.M. Malik, for those who don't know, was the Intelligence Bureau Chief, who was close to Nehru, and he was supposed to be the one source intelligence expert on China to Nehru, and he completely misled Nehru all the time. But Nehru should have used his head,
He should have used it.
because he was getting other inputs.
Yeah, yeah.
And he was not using it, but that's a separate matter. The point to make simply is this: if you're going to be, if you're going to be a match or try to be a match for China, then you have to be like China in preparing to have war if that becomes necessary in your interest. And so the point, if you're vacated, by the way, the Chinese now have in the what is that sector, the Depsang sector, virtually taken over some 69 posts. We have lost 1,000 square kilometers of Indian territory, and that's a fact. The government of India still doesn't acknowledge it. But the fact is, we have lost 1,000 square kilometers of territory, critical territory, fronting on the Xinjiang highway, which we could have otherwise interdicted by land. Had we had the will and the nerve and the rest of it, which we don't have. So the short point to make is, assuming we have our forces are given everything they want, would the government still fight?
I think the problem goes a little deeper. I completely endorse this. I've been saying the same thing, that the psychological hammering that we took in 1962,
Yeah.
we've continued to carry that monkey on our shoulders. And whatever happened in Nathula, for example, has been highly exaggerated and stuff like that. There are incidents, Nathura, than the 1986 incident in the Sumdrong Valley. The main issue here is that we just haven't had the gumption to stand up to the Chinese. And the Chinese are basically bullies. They will see where they can get the upper hand, and they will go for you. And we have just been sort of rolling over again and again and again. And unless we develop that ability to just stare them back in the eye and completely remove everything else. Now that is one aspect of the problem. The other problem, which we haven't touched upon, is that our northern border management policy is actually virtually non-existent. I hate to say this in a public forum, but it's a fact. You've got ITBP looking after the northern border. You've got, we are such a mess, we don't know what's going on. The ITBP was not sharing information with the army. The army is on its own trip. Everybody is doing their own thing. The ITBP comes under the Home Ministry. We had an intelligence grid where the army was not part of it. I mean, there are major lacunas in our whole functioning. And by putting our head in the sand and pretending that these problems don't exist, they're not going to go away. And they're going to come and bite you in the butt, because this is exactly what happened in 2020. The ITBP quickly moves out, army comes in, ITBP is supposed to come under the army, but the ITBP officers turn around and tell the army, my pay grade is higher than yours, who the hell are you to tell me what to do? These are real problems, Shiv.
Yeah.
And the fact is, unless we have a border management system in place, don't forget that even in Vietnam, it was the border guards of Vietnam who gave the PLA a bloody nose in 1976. We haven't learned from anybody else's, forget about our own mistakes, we haven't learned from others' successes and failures either.
Can I just,
Yes.
I don't want to belabor the point, but the 30 to 40 additional battalions that are now being raised in ITBP.
40, I think, so 42 or so.
42 odd battalions, right? I mean, are you building up the ITBP? It's almost as if Amit Shah wants his own army. That's basically it. The reason ITBP, the CRPF, and the rest of the paramilitaries were, in a sense created by Indira Gandhi and given the kind of resources
Kind
and
of a
so on,
counterbalancing
was to counterbalance the military. Because
Yeah.
in those days there was a real fear in the Indian government that there would be, what they call Ayub Khanitis, you see, a kind of virus that would come in from Pakistan, and the Indian military would take over.
Yeah.
And that was a real fear, mind you. And so to deal with that, Indira Gandhi created all these paramills who were completely useless. As military forces, they're nearly completely useless. And you have more of them now being useless. So just having masses of useless people standing their ground at heights is not going to solve your problem, is it? But this is the kind of thing we do. Things that are not going to be helpful to India's security or Indian interests.
I need to draw back a little, lest people go off with a different view. The cutting edge, when the orders come, are the boys and girls now in the frontline squadrons. Okay? Helicopter units, transport units, radar units, logistics units. Let me tell you one thing, that all that the professor spoke, I personally feel, sir, that's for the higher echelons and the interactions what happens between the government and the higher echelons. But the cutting edge, the people who will actually, kill and get killed, unfortunately, are raring to go. Let me tell you that.
Oh yeah, that works for the army as well.
Let's be clear on this part.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
So, lest anybody gets the wrong impression that the guys up front out there in Leh, Ladakh or Northeast or in Sikkim or the Navy down south, those guys don't have the goomph to fight. No, far from it. They follow orders. And what the professor said is the high levels where many issues go in before you can actually launch war. It's not a simple thing. So the government takes into account so many other things, political, diplomatic, money, and well, let's face facts, elections. Okay, I mean, all these things play and the government thereafter takes a decision. But the fighting force is strong, class 1, first class.
I can tell you that just after the standoff began, after the Galwan clash, one of my privileges is being able to go to some of these forward areas, and I was in Ladakh sometime in late 2020, just before the operations in South Pangong began. And what Air Vice Marshal says is absolutely true. I've spent time with the airmen, soldiers there, and they are all fully ready. They're prepared like as if, they're going to be ordered to go in tomorrow. So the morale is extremely high. They're fully prepared. But yes, that aspect of us being reactive is ever present. One can get that sense as well.
Just to convey what you said.
Yes.
I was station commander Jammu when Parakram was on. And I still remember, I think it was 15th of January 2002. When the CNC came, hopping from station to station, took me aside and said, Bahadur, are you ready? That's all he said. I said, yes, sir. And then my hair is standing now. We were ready, in Parakram. And same thing, middle May, when unfortunately our army families got killed in Kaluchek.
Yeah.
That was the second time we almost went in. All right. But the government has other things.
But since 1965, it's the junior leadership of the armed forces which has actually bailed us out. And Kargil again is a classic case where the junior leadership, whether it's the Air Force, whether it's the Navy, and I've had the privilege of flying with them and operating with them. I filmed the whole Kargil war, so I think nobody had a better view of what was going on. The junior leadership in this country is something which has bailed us out time and again. And in fact, that's why what Professor Karnad is talking about, and even I am alluding to, actually hurts, because you're not backing them up. You're letting them down again and again by simply not taking certain overall decisions which strengthens their hand. How long are you going to always rely on that poor chap and say, "Chad da wo pahad pe," and going to clear the guy out? And every time they have delivered, but to push, and a lot of it has to do with institutions like the National Defence Academy and the Indian Military Academies and the Air Force Academies, where our training systems are absolutely outstanding. And as far as motivation levels go, you can't get better troops, but they have to be led, and without leadership, you're nothing.
I'll ask one more round of questions, and then I think I can open it up to the audience. I'm sure you might have questions as well. Starting once again with you, Vice Marshal, is war a real possibility between India and China in eastern Ladakh? Because this is a question from a layperson's perspective, because they see what's happening there, they see some of the images coming out of there, they do know that violence has taken place. The armies came very close to fighting once again in early 2021. Is war a real possibility, sir?
First of all, the last thing any uniformed person wants is a war.
Yeah.
Last thing. Okay? But if it comes, he'll goes. Okay. Having said that, presently I think the Chinese would have realized that their equipment is basically Russian origin, much improved, many of the new things. They have seen how things have happened in the Russia-Ukraine war. To my understanding, they would be thinking now, where is it that the Russians have gone wrong in a way? Why is it that a sort of a stalemate has happened and it's gone into a war of attrition? And rethinking this particular issue. So there is a hot water happening there in the world, shall I say?
Yeah.
They have the problem to deal with AUKUS now, Australia, UK, America. They have the South China Sea issue. They have the Japanese. They can see that we are doing exercise with the Japanese on the eastern part of China, that is. We are making a little foray into Vietnam in the South China Sea, etc. So I personally feel that war would not happen when you talk war, because they know we are ready, and generally the world opinion is not in favor of a war in any case, and things will go our way if it happens now. That's what I feel.
Okay.
Very difficult to say war, it just cannot happen like this.
Okay, but importantly, you're saying if war does happen, it'll go our way now. Why do you saying that?
I think the world opinion should be with us,
Yeah.
because we don't have, we are sort of a status quo-ish image, shall I say, that we don't want anything from them. If there's anything, they are transgressing on our territory, having already done so much from 62 onwards and before. So I don't think so. So I think the opinion should be with us, and all these things are taken into account by any national leadership before it takes a decision to go do such an important thing like war.
Professor Karnad?
Look, the question is, I think Shiv Verma talked about the Indian reactive policy and strategies and outlook. The real problem is, it's not just reactive, it's defensive, passive, reactive. So you have a triple whammy. It's not just reactive. It's defensive, passive, reactive. And that kind of an attitude, whether anybody likes it or not, seeps down into the military over time. It cannot be kept isolated from these kinds of mainstream influences. That said, is the war imminent? No. But is the war imminent? Yes. Simply because the Chinese are not idiots. They've always gotten by coercing indirectly or directly, and insofar as you are coerced and you do their bidding, there's no war. There'll never be any war with China if you give in. So the question is, are you going to give in every time by not fighting? Now, how much of a provocation do you want? They've already occupied territory. What is your LAC? Either you stick to your idea of LAC or you don't. Or it's a flexible line wherein whatever the Chinese take, they keep on taking, and that defines the new LAC. Or you say, no, this is our idea of LAC, we're going to evict you from it. Now that plainly is something beyond the Indian military in practical terms, and that's what the government thinks so. Anyway, I don't know what the military thinks of its capabilities. That's what the government thinks. And therefore you have a real problem. If the war is imminent, meaning it may happen, it'll happen if for some reason we develop a spine in standing up to China. Because think of it, all the so-called military successes we have had to date are basically against a non-adversary like Pakistan, isn't it? I'm being brutally honest here. Have we had any? We have had successes, and that comes down to the leadership. You had a Sagat Singh at Nathula in 67. You had a Sagat Singh, Lieutenant General Sagat Singh, who led, and he was the man mainly responsible for taking Dhaka, who is not heralded. He couldn't even make army commander. Lesser people made it. But the finest fighting commander never made it. So you have something wrong in the rewards that you're given in military terms, right? It's an attitude, that's what I mean, it seeps down. People become, as I said, uniformed bureaucrats, uniformed babus. They are risk averse. That's fair enough. Because if all you have been acculturated to is a government that says, "Theek hai, let's give in a little bit, war nahi chahiye, ye wo," then, we have peace. And they say, we have peace of the graveyard. We can happily live with the graveyard next to our homes. That kind of an attitude. So, really, and one last thing, Shiv, if there's going to be imminent war, and we are not prepared, because our forces are not equipped to fight, our army is not prepared, it's basically a plains warfare army, even now. It'll take 25 years for it to become a mountain offensive army. And do we have the time? And the other thing is, if we don't, and we are faced with a situation where either we succumb to pressure once again, or we try to be proactive, then would you rather not be proactive? And that's what I've been recommending in my books. What do? I say, use your nuclear weapons as a short fuse deterrent. Keep it, forward deploy our Agni 5s, have the Agni 1s and so on, nuclear warheaded, forward deploy them, announce it to the world that if anything happens, we will merely react. We will not be the initiators of nuclear war. But if anybody crosses, we will in fact go strategic. If you don't hold out the threat, there's no threat to hold out to the Chinese. There's nothing else you have, honestly. They're not going to be thwarted and deterred by any of your Air Force edge that you have because of the altitude and the ordnance load you can carry. That's not the deterrent. What's the strategic deterrent is you can take out the Fujian coast with Agni 5s. That's a deterrent because that will send China back to the Stone Age economically. They are going to be the fastest rising economy, it'll be the main primary economy of the world by 2040. If we kill that or threaten to kill that, they'll very quickly understand. But that means we have to back up our deterrent talk with actual deployment up front, a very short fuse deterrent. And one last thing, and people mistake what I keep saying, that this guy is a hardline, ultra hawk and so on and so forth. That's how K. Subramaniam, of all people, defined me, which is ridiculous, because the late Subramaniam, and we used to have this discussion with all the time in the National Security Advisory Board and elsewhere. But the problem is, and you hear the generals and air marshals and all the military people saying that, which really bothers me, when they say nuclear weapons are for deterrence, not for fighting. Are Baba, they are weapons. They are for weapons. Unless the enemy sees us prepare for using them, there is no deterrence. Deterrence is my field. Is my nuclear deterrence is my field. I'm telling you, there's no deterrent. That's why Chinese are hardly going to be bothered if you say, well, we're going to go in with your Air Force and you're going to bring in attack helicopters. No, that's not going to be deterrent.
I disagree, sir, on the nuclear part.
Okay. Almost out of time, so the final question to Shiv Kunal.
I basically feel...
But I just want to narrow it down to one final question. You can add to what they've said and also answer my question, which is, what is the road ahead now? Is there going to be a resolution to it? Is this the new normal? Is this the new status quo? Everyone just lives with this now. Is there a possibility of the Chinese pulling back?
Firstly,
things going back to a pre-2020
I think we need to define war first. And I think 2019 onward, we are at war with China. All the pretenses that there was possibilities of some sort of normalcy on the border and that Pakistan was the main threat, and we were behaving like ostriches with our head in the sand. I think all that's gone out of the window. The conflict has begun. It is not just an India-China thing. It's also the United States and China jostling for world power. We are all bit players in this, and the situation is constantly evolving. War does not necessarily mean fighters streaming across the sky and missiles going left and right, but it's being fought at the cyber level, it's being fought at the economic level, it's being fought at 150 levels. A lot of those levels we are not even aware of. What Professor Karnad has just said in terms of deterrence and missiles, and he's talking nuclear, but I had actually advocated exactly the same thing in 2020 in my own article in Sunday Guardian. And I have also been saying, what's the point of having these missiles if you're not going to bloody well use them? So deploy them, and in fact, tell the Chinese that we've got them in Shimla, we've got them in Dehradun, we've got them here, and they're primed and they're ready to go. If you do anything, we will react. The way ahead is that, okay, I mean, we've also got to be very careful about not getting blindly pushed into the western corner, because one of the reasons why 1962 Mao did react was because of the CIA involvement in what was going on. We blindly went into certain things. We did allow U-2 flights from Kalai Kunda. There was a lot of arms shipment from Sikkim, etc., which all added to the Chinese suspicion of India lining up with the United States. That, from their perspective, still remains one of the largest threats that they face, that if India actually gets forced into the Western camp with no holds barred, it would be a completely different scenario. And the Americans have always looked at Tibet as the soft underbelly of China. We have to, purely from an Indian perspective, and I've said this time and again, we have to prepare for Fortress India. We have to knock off all the other nonsense which is going on about the fault lines that we are so good at creating, Hindus, Muslims, Christians, Punjab mein ye ho raha hai, wo ho raha hai, because everything affects us. National security, when we realize we have to start thinking Fortress India. You're sitting in Bangalore today, you're not far removed from what is going on in the Himalayas. If you're sitting in Trivandrum, you're no further removed. I mean, you are as much a part of the whole game. And we just cannot afford to let our guard down. And you can only quote from what Franklin Roosevelt used to say. He used to say that if you want to walk alone, you better carry a big stick. And whether Make in India and all this stuff is all, there's a lot happening in terms of what is going on. I was involved with the Navy. I know that we have built ships like INS Delhi, INS Mysore and all that way back by 1900s, and I mean before the turn of the century. And there's a lot happening. The LCA, the Tejas, all these developments are going on, but they're not enough. We've really got to get more and more self-reliant. Be very clear that India comes first as far as everything is concerned, and be very careful that we are not actually pushed into the Western thing unless it suits us. And these games are going on. I mean, it's constantly on. And I disagree on this point that war is imminent. War is already on. World War III began with the COVID outbreak.
Yeah.
And it's going on. And when history is written 50 years down the line, you'll be wondering why you're sitting here without helmets and you're not in a bunker actually, because the situation will look like that in retrospect.
Just one sentence
Yeah,
before
one
you
last
open.
one. Yes, please.
Shiv said a very important point. When you talk of comprehensive national security, societal oneness, societal cohesion is so very important. So any strife within our society based on whatever, thinking, ideology, religion, language, whatever, that affects our social fabric. And social fabric, the tenacity of social fabric is so important in comprehensive national security.
That's a great word to end this on, but I think we just have about 5 minutes left for some questions. Yes.
Hello. Professor Karnad, thank you so much for your brutal honesty. I hope you'll humor me a little bit with my brutal honesty as well. It seems to me that the push is to grow a spine overnight. How do we do that? Can we possibly out-bully a bully? China is an unpredictable player. And the truth is that there are different facets to our capabilities. You mentioned that, yes, we were preoccupied with Pakistan for X number of years. Would it not require some amount of diplomacy, some amount of capability building before we can go out and say, listen, let's use nuclear power or let's deter with these facets? Thank you.
Professor Karnad, yeah.
Yeah, I think people tend to forget that diplomatic success is invariably built on hard power. If you do not have hard power, your diplomacy becomes hollow by its very nature. And therefore, the heyday, we tend to sort of enhance the notion of diplomacy as a peacekeeping mechanism from Nehru's days, and he was a master, let's be very clear. He was a great statesman. He understood, by the way, the utility of force. He's the one who cultivated, as concurrently Minister for Atomic Energy, the nuclear weapons thrust of our energy program under the great Dr. Homi Bhabha. So he had the classical notion, but unfortunately he also was a bit of a Hamlet, indecisive. By the way, incidentally, just so you know, just a quick short conclusion on the nuclear aspect, we could have become rather, we had our plutonium reprocessing plant that went full stream in March of 1964. In May 1964, Nehru dies. In 1962, at the time of the Chinese war, Bhabha goes to Nehru, and this is, by the way, all recorded in my book, Nuclear Weapons in Indian Security, so it's all well documented. Bhabha goes to Nehru and says, Indian people are demoralized, it was a brutal victory, humiliation for the Indian army. There was, and even extraordinarily, if you go into the Chinese records, the lead Chinese marshal of in the Tibetan forces coming into India, Peng Hui, at that times, cautioned Mao. They said, no, this is the great Indian army that defeated the Japanese and beat up on Hitler and so on and so forth. And then Mao shut him down and said, yeah, but they're not led by the British. They're led by Nehru, and he had understood, he had evaluated Nehru very well. He had no respect for Nehru. So he said, no, go ahead, he can't do it. They can't, and it was proved. Within 15 days, the whole damn war was over. So the point to make really is, diplomacy is what we have relied on, almost as a proxy for war. Now, the point is, going back to Vegetius, who was the great, marshal and general of the Roman armies in God knows when, he said that if you don't prepare for war, you'll not have peace. Meaning, you have to have all the accoutrements of war and be ready to go to war at any instant for you to have peace, and that is then becomes the essence of your diplomacy.
Gentlemen, good afternoon. Knowingly the Chinese tactics, both on the war front and the trade front, and having the $100 billion trade deficit with them, and Chinese entrenched so deeply into our manufacturing sectors, pharmaceutical ingredient dependence on Chinese makes, considering all this Chinese impact on Indian layers, whether it is in the economic front or in the common society, where you think the impact on our preparedness, considering this economical dependence of India and China with the war preparedness at the borders? How do you see that, and your thoughts on that? The question is open to all you three gentlemen.
Shiv, you want to take it? I'll go last on that.
I think these are the issues that play up at the high level of governance. So while it's easy to say, we should be ready, the hard power, put the nuclear missiles here, there, everywhere. No, I don't mean to, no, I'm just saying. I think these are issues that play up. Now, it's not that passivity has crept into me. It's not that. It's just that I think these are the realities that any government of any country has to analyze before it takes a major step. So the fact remains that it's $100 billion now. When I retired and started talking and lecturing that time it was $60 billion. That time the trade deficit was some $35 billion. Now it is some $80 billion. So it has to, the trade deficit part. So it has to be an overall development in all the sectors, and there comes a time when a country says, okay, now is our time, and it is here I think we should learn from the Chinese. We must, because Deng Xiaoping said in the 70s, that hide your capabilities, bide your time, and I personally feel that we are doing too much of public relation exercises and going on TV and this and that, and we are this and we are that. Let's get to that. I feel, my personal opinion. Let's get that and then talk. So hide your capabilities, bide your time. From 70s to end of the turn of the century, the Chinese didn't raise a squeak. They were learning, they were preparing, they were getting the economy up. And then they have started speaking, and now suddenly the world woke up. That's what I feel, sir.
Just in the interest of time, one final question. So, and you can answer that question as a, yeah, Smita, go ahead.
Thanks. Shiv, great session. I've got so many headlines, I don't know where to begin. Shiv Kunal says we are at war. Professor Karnad says deploy nuclear weapons. And I think AVM Bahadur said that the world opinion will be with us. To all three gentlemen, is there something called a limited conflict, and is it imminent? Thank you.
Can I just add one small bit here? Is India ready for a two-front war with India and with Pakistan and China?
Well, the two-front, I mean, Pakistan's always been a cat's paw for China. They have used this with great finesse since the 1960s. In fact, in my book on 1965, I have brought this out, that the Operation Gibraltar, which was where they infiltrated in a big way in the valley, was actually planned by Mao with Bhutto. And then Bhutto bypassed Ayub Khan and went with the GOC 12 division of Pakistan, and they did what they had to do. A two-front war is always a possibility, but I think Pakistan, given its exact current scenario, is not in a position to do anything other than just survive, even without us firing a shot. As far as the Chinese are concerned, they will continue to try and destabilize you, especially on the Himalayan front, because actually in their heads, and I think even in ours, we really should be looking a lot more at the Indian Ocean, especially the Malacca Straits, our own Andaman and Nicobar assets, etc. Part of the Chinese strategy, in my opinion, is also to divert attention from the Indian Ocean and keep us hopping on that side, because New Delhi, unfortunately, though we should ideally, we look at our coastline, our maritime assets, etc. We should be on a completely different thought process, but unfortunately, the Navy still, in our way of thinking, our thinking is landlocked. Whether there will be a immediate conflict, I do not think it's in either side's interest to actually get into a Tata Tutu up there. There will be dhakkam dhakki going on all the time, because that is the way they operate. But an actual short term, and it serves nobody's purpose, neither ours nor the Chinese.
Professor Karnad, limited conflict or two-front war?
Yeah, limited, of course. All war is going to be limited. I mean, by its very nature, you're not going to have total war, like the Second World War, where everybody's warring against everybody else in 2 camps or 3 camps, whatever. And the few countries that do remain neutral become fairly irrelevant, like Switzerland or Portugal under Salazar in the Second World War. The point to make, though, is that if you're going to, it's going to be limited. But the coercive aspects of strategic armaments is what we need to appreciate a lot more than we do. We are tactical minded. That's the point I'm trying very hard to make, that our military is tactical minded. And I refer to it by saying that this is also a colonial military force, and the Royal Indian Air Force became the Indian Air Force, the British Army became the Indian Army, the Royal Navy and so on became the Indian Navy. So the mindset was that and this is not what any of the the flag rank officers of the 3 services say, but the fact is that the attitude is that they are a regional adjunct of some other power, a tactical adjunct to some other power. Like the Royal Air Force from the very beginning. I mean, if you look at, I talked to, Air Chief Marshal Arjun Singh at his home many times, and I have him on record actually, I have not used it, wherein his attitude was so much like, you have short-legged aircraft, the Royal Air Force is going to do, and this, by the way, was manifest in '62, because you had the then Chief of the Royal Air Force, Sir John Slessor, who was talking about using Vulcan bombers, V bombers, to take off from Indian airfields to hit China as a strategic backstop for countries like India in the 50s. So this is a real thing. This is not something that I'm alluding to by way of literary allusion or anything of the kind. This is real history. So limited war, yes, there will be. If any war occurs, it's going to be limited. But what kind of limited war, and it's going to advantage whom at the end of it? That's what we need to worry about. We need to worry about the outcomes. And therefore, that's all the point I'm making, that unless you are far more aggressive and then communicate this aggressiveness in terms of protecting your interests, the Chinese are going to make mincemeat out of you.
Final word from Vice Marshal.
Finally, it's a question of outcomes, as Professor says. When you talk of war, we are not talking of all-out war. Take over India. No way. But the point is, will India's standing in the world be affected if we lose a small enclave? I think the answer is yes. So when you're talking of limited conflict, what we have to guard against is, when you're talking with China, is that we don't lose territory. Because that would be his aim, to show the world that, listen, India is nothing, we have captured whatever. That would be his aim. We can't say, I'll take over Jammu and Kashmir. That's not possible. So, limited conflict, as you say, is what, if it happens, would be this, with that sort of an aim, to bring India down in the world standing in the eyes of the world from that way. That is what we need to be on guard against. Then the reciprocal part is, can we take over a little bit of, the Xinjiang, or go back into the, will it affect China's standing? I don't think the world will even come to know, is what my point is. That is what the issue is, because of the different type of societies that we have got in our two countries. So limited conflict, yes. Two-front war, theoretically yes, but the point is, would China come to Pakistan's aid if Pakistan launches an attack? It's not ever done in history. With all the wars that have happened, they have not come. Would they risk their reputation that we, take over some big part or big chunk of POK, and China helping them, China's image comes down? That despite your help, this is what the Indians have done? Doubtful. So that's what I feel.
Thank you very much. We're out of time. I know many of you have questions, but we're out of time. Thank you so much.
Thank you for this.